All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. A warm welcome as well to our online viewership behind the camera over there. My name is Stan Veuger. I am a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on the Capital Region's housing market. Today's event also marks the release of this year's State of the Capital Region report, an annual report on a facet of the DC regional economy produced by the George Washington University Center for Washington Area Studies. This year's edition on the sort of recent past and potential future of the DC mortgage market is co-authored by Leah Brooks, Jenny Schutz, and me, and is available online. You can find the link at today's event page. Today here at the event, we're going to discuss regional mortgage markets, but we're certainly not going to limit ourselves to that. Instead, we'll talk about DMV real estate markets a little more broadly, what the implications of the macro environment and the post-COVID work arrangements are for policymakers and for private sector decision makers alike. Specifically, the proceedings this afternoon will unfold in two parts. First, we'll hear from Brian McCabe. Brian is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development in the Office of Policy Development and Research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He is on leave from Georgetown, where he's Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. He's also a former co-author of the State of the Capital Region report. Brian will deliver remarks in a bit, and after that, I'll ask him some questions, and so can you. Then the second part of today's event is a panel discussion featuring four outstanding panelists. We'll have my co-author, Leah Brooks. She's a professor in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University and director of the GW Center for Washington Area Studies. We'll have Katie Crystal, who is a member of the Arlington County Board, which she also chaired, I believe, in 2018, 2022. She represents Arlington on the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and will soon be heading over to Tyson's Corner, which we'll talk about. Then Nadia Evangelou is a senior economist, director of real estate research at the National Association of Realtors. Nadia, welcome. And then Jerem Price is the president and CEO of the Downtown DC Business Improvement District, which he just told us is a fantastic job. Welcome, Jerem, by the way. If you have any questions about any part of the DC government, he has in the past worked for the office for the Chancellor for DC Public Schools, in the Department of Parks and Recreation, the Department of Employment Services, maybe also for the Deputy Mayor for Education. Any complaints you have about the functioning of the DC government, he's your guy. You can email him, text messages, everything is fine. Anyway, the panel will have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll take questions from you and from our online audience. For our online viewers, please submit your questions to beatrice.lee@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. There's one person who's ever used that Twitter handle, I believe. But you'll find your way. Information is on the event page. With that out of the way, let me welcome Brian onto the stage. Brian, thank you for doing this.
Great. Thanks, Stan. And thanks for everybody for joining this morning, this early afternoon. To my colleagues, former colleagues, for authoring the State of the Capital Region report. It's really nice to be back today in this capacity to reflect a little bit on the housing market and the state of housing and raise some sort of key issues here in the district. On the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the midst of a housing market that I think to many of us feels unpredictable and unbalanced, sometimes downright out of control, I'm really grateful for the chance to be here today. I had a chance to read through the report last week, and the report shares some really important information about mortgage markets and about lending across the region, so vital components of a healthy housing market and something near and dear to my own professional work. As Stan mentioned, for the last decade, I've done research on local housing policy and neighborhoods as a sociologist at Georgetown University. My work focuses on communities in the district that are struggling to provide affordable housing, often in the experience of intense gentrification. But today I have the benefit of seeing federal housing policy as an insider to the policy development process. I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development today, although I should note that my remarks reflect my own thoughts rather than any official positions of the administration. But even so, I think this set of roles offers an opportunity to reflect on the market from multiple vantage points, right? From the perspective of somebody involved in federal housing policy decisions, as a researcher keenly aware of housing markets and their implications for wealth building, for economic mobility, for inequality, as a commissioner on the local ANC in Logan Circle, and as a Washingtonian with an app on my iPhone, or a folder on my iPhone actually, full of apps that track the housing market closely. So hopefully my comments reflect sort of multiple perspectives. So in many ways, I think the DC housing market has behaved the way markets have behaved in many parts of the country, right? And that's a fact that I think is underscored in some of the findings from today's report. The market was perhaps surprisingly quite heated during COVID. The supply of units for sale has contracted remarkably in the last year or so. Buyers raced to buy units, but now many of them are feeling locked out of a market. So perhaps most centrally, and I know our panel later will discuss this, right, we're facing an interest rate environment that's reshaping the way that buyers and sellers think about housing. And hopefully the ongoing work of the Center for Washington Area Studies and tracking the market will continue to inform our understandings, particularly in DC. But in the last decade, right, historically low historically low interest rates not only lowered the cost of buying a home, they created a new set of expectations around housing, right? Few people doubted the value of home ownership as a tool for savings, and everybody wanted to be part of the spoils of home ownership. But higher interest rates have done more than simply create barriers to entering the market, especially for first-time home buyers. They've created uncertainty in the housing market, and they will perhaps encourage us to rethink the broader place of home ownership, right? We have to think about whether these interest rates are an aberration, and if so, if we can just wait them out. Or are 7% interest rates the new norm, right? Thereby shifting what our long-term calculus is for buyers and sellers alike. We need to consider how this uncertainty shifts buyers and seller behavior in the capital region, and whether new interest rates means that homeownership will become permanently unattainable for households that are on the margins. And I know that the panel will get into the questions around interest rates in our housing markets a little bit more. So while the financial upsides of homeownership have been historically clear, one of the downsides has related to mobility. Right? Homeownership has always been stickier than renting. The transaction costs of selling a home are high. The transaction costs for homeowners of moving are higher than they are for renters who might otherwise follow jobs. But how important is this limitation of homeownership in an era of increased flexibility around teleworking? So here today, as we reflect on the state of the city and the state of the region, I think we need to remember that teleworking has not only changed patterns of work, teleworking has changed the way that we think about housing, right? Including the types of housing that we want, the amount of space that we need, and the places that we want to live. So for some, teleworking signals the end of cities and urban life, right? A proposition that, if true, would be a devastating blow for Washington, D.C., right? If we didn't need to come to work every day, we wanted to live in West Virginia rather than Arlington, or telework from Montana rather than from the district. The verdict on teleworking seems clear. It's here to stay. But the consequences for our cities, and I think particularly for our downtowns, are far less settled. Many of our cities have the opportunity to reinvent themselves, but they've done this many times throughout history, and they'll need the partnership of developers, of policymakers, and of other actors to do so. Along with cities like San Francisco and New York, which have big pockets of commercial real estate that have not, and likely will never, fully rebound, there's perhaps no place where the opportunity for reinvention of a downtown is more exciting than it is here in Washington, D.C. So most days, not today because I get to be here with you, but most days, I work from the Weaver building on LaFont Plaza. I will, perhaps controversially to some folks in this room, call that a beautiful piece of brutalist architecture, but that is a ghost town on most days, like many other federal office buildings and many other privately owned office buildings in the city. In DC, it's quite clear that the federal workforce will never again be fully in person, and nor should it be. But we have, as the urban theorist David Harvey reminds us, built an entire physical landscape, an entire city behind a certain type of capitalism, right? An economy where people commute to the city for work, where people work in person at downtown urban cores, where the construction of new Class A office building drives companies to fancier workspaces filled with more amenities that are required to attract commercial tenants, and where business districts, largely designed for commuters to come into the city, offered very little after business hours. So in DC, we have an opportunity to rethink our downtown, and Mayor Bowser and her team have done an admirable job starting that conversation. Recognizing that the federal workforce is unlikely to return to in-person work, the federal government needs to commit to a new direction for its real estate throughout the city as well. Investing in technologically sophisticated, flexible workspaces suitable to the post-COVID era is important for the federal workforce. But disposing of buildings whose function are obsolete for the federal government is critical to the rest of the city and to American taxpayers. We need to be creative and innovative and forward-looking on converting commercial spaces to residential ones, but the challenges here are formidable. Many of the oldest commercial spaces in the city, those spaces that are the least desirable for modern-day office space, are also the most difficult to convert to residential use because of their architectural and design features that don't lend themselves well to that conversion. The city relies on commercial space for tax revenue, but the citizens of DC and other cities and tourists to the city rely on these buildings to create vibrant, active urban spaces. And we must work to ensure that the built environment does exactly that. So as we consider the conversion of these buildings, including the way we use these conversions to meet the demand for rental units, we also need to recognize the limits of our current affordable housing models. Where it works, the combination of tax credits, project-based vouchers, money from a production trust fund, and other traditional sources can create affordable housing, and it can create a lot of it. But these approaches make it difficult, if not impossible, to build housing for the poorest renters, those that are earning 30% or less of the AMI. We need to open the door to conversations that are different from the ones that we're having now, be it conversations about social housing or new type of housing model, conversations about the way that the city uses property that it owns but is underutilized in its current form, or whether federal buildings that no longer function as robust office spaces could be converted to serve the lowest income population. Now, in truth, I have no prediction about the future of these conversions, only the knowledge that our current models of housing affordability are often failing the poorest households, especially in high-cost cities and regions like ours. This is reflected in an increasingly visible crisis of unsheltered homelessness in the district, not to mention the less visible but increasingly challenging problems of chronic homelessness, residential instability, and evictions and forced moves. Ours is a city that is strikingly rich, and it should never be acceptable for us to have unhoused neighbors on the streets. When we think about our policy goal, it should never be to reduce homelessness by 25% or 50%. Right, the only acceptable policy goal, especially in a city as wealthy as ours, should be to release it to 0%. While homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods are reaping the financial rewards of rising property values, our homeless neighbors are bearing the burden. So new approaches are needed to solve the housing challenges. And this may include new revenue sources, right? We could think about taxing the profits that are extracted by gentrifiers who benefit handily from changes in the neighborhoods around them, or may involve dedicating additional revenue from transfer taxes or other real estate-related transactions directly to the provision of affordable housing. But beyond those policy solutions, solving this problem also requires a new approach to our politics, one where we see homelessness as a social problem rather than one borne exclusively by our unhoused neighbors, a politics where we believe that people have a right to be housed, even if they can't afford to pay for it out of their own pocket. So ultimately, one consequence of our housing ecosystem is a city that's already vastly unequal, and a region that's vastly unequal is becoming more so every day. The consequences of this inequality are baked into housing markets, and they reverberate throughout society. We'll have difficulty attracting teachers and essential workers. Inequality will fuel feelings of vulnerability, economic uncertainty, and restlessness. Homeowners will continue to amass and build wealth to the exclusion of those who can't enter the housing market, reinforcing longstanding patterns of racial segregation and inequality. As we continue to think about housing markets in the capital region, both today and beyond, including the set of challenges, both invisible and those that are visible in our community, I hope today's report, and more importantly, the continued work of our colleagues here at AEI, at GW's Center for Washington Area Studies, and other researchers throughout the region, continue to inform these debates. In the federal government, we talk about and remain committed to principles of evidence-based policy, where data and analyses like the ones done today inform the direction of future policy. And I trust that this report, once again, offers an opportunity for leaders throughout the region to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for your comments. Obviously, you covered a very broad scope of issues. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions on topics that I am interested in, or comments you made that I disagree with, and then we can go to the room. So first thing I wanted to ask you is, you emphasized at the end of your remarks the need for, I guess, a broad set of housing options involve more participation from the DC government to deal with homelessness, to deal with the lack of affordable housing for lower income households. Now, of course, DC also already plays a pretty significant role in that market, and, for example, runs a public housing agency that I think deals with reported vacancy rates of about 30–40%.
Yeah.
Does going down that route more really feel like a promising avenue to solve the problem?
Yeah. So, well, I think it depends on what we think of going down that route more. So I don't think that there's a conversation or an interest in sort of building more traditional public housing, sort of as we've built it before, right? I mean, it's quite clear from sort of recent reporting and our understanding of the DC Housing Authority that there are some really, big important issues that need to be addressed there, right? High vacancy rates, units that are not inhabitable, right? This is housing that hasn't had the sort of necessary upkeep and investment. And largely, I think that goes back to the way public housing was funded in America, right? So public housing was intended to be funded with, or intended to be maintained with the rent revenue that was collected, right, from public housing residents. And as the residents got poor in those communities, right, there was less rent revenue and less ability to keep buildings up to date. So I think that the conversation that's interesting and I think needs to be had is about a sort of different set of social housing models. I'll actually say at HUD, we're going next week. The Deputy Secretary is spearheading a delegation to the International Social Housing Festival in Berlin, festival being a nice word for conference. Right, but I think in part to think about sort of models that are different. One thing that's been striking from my time at HUD is to think about, some of our programs work incredibly well for certain tenants, right? So housing vouchers, for example, my sense of the work on housing vouchers is that for those that need a shallow subsidy, right, a voucher really offers a sort of lifeline, right? It offers stability. Vouchers are great for families that are able to lease in place. But there are other families that have a much more difficult time renting with a housing voucher, right? We have some recent research at HUD that suggests that the lease-up rate, right, when somebody gets a voucher and then goes onto the market, the lease-up rate is only 50 or 60%, right? In other words, 40% of people that get a voucher simply can't find housing on the private market with it, right? And certainly we know that it's some kinds of households that have more difficulty, right? So families with large families with children, right, often have difficulty with a voucher in the way that sort of elderly households may not. So one of the things that I think it's important, and when I think about kind of rethinking models, is thinking about sort of matching models with needs of households, right? So that if a voucher model works really well for smaller families or for those without children or for those with sort of higher incomes but still eligible, can we focus sort of that model on families where it works and think about other families that are always going to have trouble on this market, right? The lowest income families, larger families, and sort of other assistance models. So, but I would just sort of to clarify my own thoughts on this. I don't think the conversation around social housing is really going back to a public housing model. I think it's thinking a little bit differently about some of the city-owned resources, city-owned buildings and properties, and whether there's, those are off-market, whether there's an opportunity to kind of do deeper affordability there.
And DC has done in the more in the market space, but of course has done a pretty good job, I think, using city land to increase production.
Absolutely.
And thereby avoiding the sort of political fights over upzoning, I think, to a significant extent. I don't know how much more leeway there is in that space.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll see. A different question. So you talked about this is the moment when you sounded most like a sociologist. You talked about the model of capital, the built environment we've built around our current model of capitalism. Of course, one of the things we do in the current model of capitalism is we usually allocate things based on the price system to some extent. Yeah. And so one thing you would expect in a metro area like DC is you would expect people to outbid each other for the most attractive residential areas. And so one thing you might expect is that lower income folks live farther from the downtown core if that is attractive. Now, because of the jurisdictional divisions, I think you have a temptation sometimes for DC to really prioritize, moving people into the urban core that would otherwise, live in the suburbs or in the exurbs. Does that really feel like a good use of DC taxpayer money? I mean, there's all kinds of social problems. Should we really, emphasize, and it's a very costly, big part of the budget, to really emphasize selecting specific lucky residents and giving them houses in the most attractive parts of the metro area? Is that?
Yeah. So, I think none of our resources should go to selecting lucky residents. So here's the sort of underlying problem of this, right? Is that all of our affordable housing programs rely on exactly this, some sort of selection, right? A lottery where you got it and you didn't get it, and we've radically altered the course of your life, right? And so kind of at all levels of government, right, housing is this one place where, right, we don't do this for SNAP benefits, right? We don't say, oh, you got food stamps and you didn't, good luck to you. We don't do it on Medicaid, right? We don't lottery off Medicaid and one person gets Medicaid and 4 people don't. So, I mean, I think the sort of fundamental question is about why we do this as a lottery. But I think you're right to raise the question of, sort of how much we use our resources to encourage families to move to higher, like we'll call them higher opportunity neighborhoods, right? This has been a sort of mantra of federal housing policy, right? The effort to move folks to, or create opportunities to move to neighborhoods. But, in the voucher program, that's more expensive, right? Housing is more expensive, so the voucher subsidy is bigger. Given the allocations from Congress, you can help a smaller number of people move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, or a larger number of people sort of stay in poorer neighborhoods, right? And so to me, this is, there are sort of two sides of this coin, right? We should be investing in those communities that are lower income, that are poor, and those are the sort of place-based investments. Of course, right, that results in rising rents, potential, displacement. I think there's some mixed evidence on the degree of displacement there. But I think the sort of, the policy position that sort of reigned across administrations for decades is really about opportunity, right? And sort of having, folks want to move to those kinds of neighborhoods, providing that opportunity. We're doing a lot of work around small area fair market rents as a sort of way to do that. But I think you're absolutely right to raise that this is not without cost, right? And it is the case that since those are more expensive, no matter sort of, whether it's in the voucher program or new construction, sort of giving opportunity to some may come at the extent of, opportunity for others.
Then one final question before we turn to the audience. You talked about revenue sources, and you highlighted in particular a number of revenues sources that basically are taxation on existing.
Yeah, that's right.
Or on existing houses, or increases in the value of housing. Do you feel there's a tension between raising revenue for, I guess, the housing for the lowest income households on the one hand, on the other hand, making sure that housing supply elasticities don't become even smaller than they are already by making new construction more expensive,
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean,
because I understand the logic of do it, or at least the political attraction of doing taxation in the same sector you want to do the spending in, right?
Yeah.
But when we do that in transportation, it's often to correct for externalities, through a gas tax or through congestion taxes. I don't think that's quite the case. That logic doesn't really apply here.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree that logic doesn't apply here. I mean, I think the sort of question, and I raised the question of, on capital gains and gentrifying neighborhoods, right? Sort of, should we tax that for an immediate reinvestment? I could buy a house in a gentrifying neighborhood in a couple of years, make $200,000 on that house. That's a pretty regular DC story, or at least it was for the last, the last 10 years.
Well, that's the thing, right? You don't know. That's why those returns are high.
Right. There probably was a little risk on that, but yes, right. But the idea, I think, is that, right, those are gains that somebody fully didn't earn, right? The good luck of having picked the right neighborhood and had the opportunity to buy, and whether or not we should take sort of who should get those gains, right? In the current system, right, the homeowner who was able to buy in a neighborhood and made a good bet on a neighborhood, right? I do think there's a question of, if you tax those at 100%, right, it might deter people from making those investments. But if you tax them at 10%, would it? Right?
I mean, we have property taxes, right?
What's that?
We have property taxes.
Sure.
Yeah.
I
don't know. Okay. Well, I don't know. Maybe this one I think we'll agree to disagree. Let's take a few questions from the audience. Let's go over here first, Jenny Schutz, one of our co-authors.
So Brian, as you mentioned, the federal government provides a lot of the subsidy for low-income households, whether through public housing or vouchers and things like funding for homelessness programs and support. But getting housing built on the ground is still primarily the responsibility of local governments. So for instance, if local governments make it hard to build apartments, then it's harder to find places for people to go with vouchers or blocking supportive housing developments. Are there better ways that haven't been tried for the federal government to incentivize local governments to adopt housing-friendly policies, right? So opening up some of the high-income neighborhoods and building more rental housing, right? Maybe even nudging them towards converting unused office space. How could the federal government play more of a role in sort of pushing the politics in the right direction?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jenny. It's one of the things that's been sort of interesting to sort of watch the struggle on within the federal government, right? The federal government has released a supply action plan, right? A sort of federal supply action plan, but at the end of the day, sort of the issues around supply are really, right, they're local issues, they're state issues, they're city issues. I mean, I think there's potentially an opportunity to tie some of the money that comes out of the federal government to these changes, right? So we can think about some of the money that's coming out of CPD through block grant programs, through home partnerships, and thinking about whether or not, so a lot of that is formula funding at the moment, right? And there's a sort of set of uses that it can be used for. It would be a sort of large statutory change to do that, but to be able to sort of tie that money to particular kinds of changes, right? So particular kinds of sort of zoning changes, or to do a bonus or a bump for certain kinds of developments. But this is a place where I actually think the federal government has a difficult time intervening, right? Because so much of this is at the local level.
Yeah. Very good. Let's go all the way in the back. Sorry, please wait for the mic and then introduce yourself. And then, sorry, I sort of introduced Jenny, so you got exempted from that. Please go ahead. Yeah.
JP Hogan. I'm wondering, where is the history in the gentrification and turning low-rise slum areas into high-rises, that a percentage of low-income housing could go into the new buildings as a way of fairness? Where did that start? When did it start in DC? So I remember seeing the old neighborhoods and saying there's great potential here, and now there's places like the waterfront. I'm just wondering, where did the idea start, and is it working as well as it was thought it might, or are there more problems with it?
Yeah, that's probably a history question I'm not quite prepared to answer. But I mean, it's sort of starting in the 1970s at HUD is when we start to do kind of financing of mixed income developments, right? And I think there's sort of a time when you get this shift, right? So through the 1960s at HUD, we were subsidizing public housing developments, and I think it's during that time that we start to recognize, right, the challenges of public housing about concentrating poor families in particular neighborhoods, the way that public housing was contributing to racial segregation. And so sort of that's the period really where new models of mixed income developments, right? So where we could finance the construction of buildings that had a certain percentage of them affordable. But I also think in the waterfront or Capitol Riverfront is a good example of a place where sort of as the neighborhood started to change, right, developers recognized sort of the opportunities that were available in that kind of neighborhood for mixed income developments, and that was going to sort of further drive the market. So I'm not sure that I can sort of do a history of it, or sort of even note the history here in DC. But I do think, I mean, that's the primary model, right, that we're using, and we're using it at the federal level with the redevelopment of public housing when we did it through Hope 6 or RAD conversions. At the local level, we have inclusionary zoning programs, LIHTC buildings, right? It's all sort of using the same model of mixed income developments.
Excellent. Let's do one more question. Let's go over here.
Hi, Brian. Jason Bosick from Vested Communities. We're a housing impact fund. Is HUD exploring any fractional equity models where renters and homeowners can earn equity without the burden of taking on a 30-year mortgage to get access to that path to homeownership?
Yeah, Jason, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer the specifics of your question. I will say, last month the Secretary hosted an asset building, a credit building summit. So I know that sort of this issue, right, is sort of on the table for her. It's probably the number one issue that I've heard her talk about. is whether or not there are other ways, right? And things like positive rent reporting for credit is a sort of way to start to get here. On your specific question, I'm not sure of the answer policy-wise. Happy to look into it and get back to you.
All right, let's do one more. All right, sorry. Please wait for the mic, sorry.
Yes, I worked at HUD in the last administration. Before that, over a half dozen years at the Freddie Mac Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, well, first I have to say, comment, even before there was telecommuting, HUD was basically an empty building anyway. I mean, very people showed. In fact, you could tell it because when you got in the elevator, you could go to the top floor without any stops, and that's very rare. Now I'm going to give you a tough question, and so just be prepared. I know that HUD conducted an overview and analysis of the DC Housing Authority, and it was scandalous. I mean, we don't have to go through the specifics, but it was pretty outrageous on what was being done. From safety and security to the misuse of vouchers, millions of dollars were given in vouchers, some as payoffs, but more importantly, it was over market rate.
Yeah.
And so in the wards 7 and 8, it was like $3,000 for rat-infested mold, the works. And none of this has been addressed. What is HUD doing with the DC Housing Authority now to finally, and this has been going on when I was there, it hasn't ended. A number of council people have been really upset. What are you doing to help pressure the DC Housing Authority to get its act together, basically?
Yeah. So HUD might be a relatively empty building, I would agree, but there are a lot of people that work for HUD in a lot of different divisions. So I'm not going to be able to address your question directly. I work in the Office of Policy Development and Research. We do research, we develop new policy, but we don't oversee, my office doesn't oversee the public housing. I mean, but let me actually just hit on one thing that I think is relevant here. So, one of the big findings from the DC Housing Authority, and it's true of other places beyond DC, is the question of rent reasonableness, right? So the concern is that housing authorities in the voucher program are overpaying relative to market rent, right? And sort of why is this happening? So, one possibility, and I've, in my role as a researcher actually, more so than in my role at HUD, have done work with scores of housing authorities to understand how they're running their voucher programs. And I think that you hear sort of two things that explain this. So one is that, housing authorities are really under-resourced for a lot of the work that they need to do. And so the idea of doing a rent reasonableness calculation on every sort of voucher is actually just quite time-consuming, right? And I've learned quite a bit about different ways that they do it or different softwares that they have, but it's actually just administratively very burdensome. But the other reason, and this goes back to something I noted earlier, a lot of voucher holders are having difficulty finding units on the rental market, right? A place like DC, very, very difficult for them to find a unit that meets the payment standard. And I think housing authorities often don't want to be the agencies that deny you a voucher, right? That deny you housing. Because if I come back to the DC Housing Authority and I say, okay, this unit rents for $3,000, and they say, well, the market rent is really only $2,500, then it's on the housing authority that they essentially denied somebody housing. And so that, I think, is part of the challenge that the agencies themselves are facing, is that it's such a tough rental market out there for low-income households, period, but low-income households with a voucher especially, that to many of them it feels like, right, they'd rather overpay the rent, right, rather than turn somebody down who desperately needs housing. So I hear you as a sort of core issue here.
And this relates back, of course, to doing this for only a central jurisdiction in a big metro area.
Absolutely. Well, and Stan, I think consistent with the theme for today, right, we think of the housing market as a regional housing market, right? And that's so important to how we understand the housing market and the economy here. This is why this is a State of the Capital Region report and not the State of the Capital City report. But that's not true about how we think about vouchers, right? We have 15 agencies in the metro area that run separate voucher programs. They have different payment standards. They have different jurisdictions. They have different rules for occupancy. So that is deeply, deeply problematic. I will say there are some brilliant HUD brains on this, but it's really, really intractable problem to work on. But I have a colleague working on, right, PHA consolidation, right? What would it look like? Probably not in the DC market, but if you could take 14 housing authorities in the metro area and make them one, right? The efficiencies of doing that, treating the market like a single market would be sort of revolutionary in the program. Now, there are lots of local politics about why that would never happen, because surely Alexandria and Arlington, Loudoun County don't want to give up their their housing authorities and the revenue coming in. But that is actually, I think, one of the, if we could sort of solve that problem and treat public housing agencies like we treat housing markets as something that's regional rather than city or county based, I think that would go a long way to solving some of these challenges.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. And with
Thanks,
that,
Dan.
thank you. All right, I think we're going to reconfigure the stage, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Thank you to our panelists here for joining us. We're going to talk. We're going to continue to talk about the DC housing market. I'm going to first ask Leah Brooks to talk a little bit about the report that motivates today's get-together. So, Leah, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Stan. And I want to say first, this report was joint with Stan and Jenny over there. And due to the stupendous research assistance of Daniel Birch over there, he can wave. If you're looking for a data analyst, he's looking for a job. He's very good. Highly recommend him. All right, so this is the 2023 version of the State of the Capital Region, the ups and downs of the mortgage markets from the financial crisis through the pandemic. Just a few words about the Center for Washington Area Studies. Our mission is to improve the lives of people in the greater Washington area by studying the neighborhoods and communities of our region, and this is one of the ways we do it. We produce policy-relevant research on the Capital Region, like today's report, and we host events, or have Stan host them, thank you, Stan, events for the public on topical issues. In the past, we've written about housing in 2019, demographics. We wrote a report about demographics, and then COVID came, and that seemed a little irrelevant, so we wrote a COVID addendum. We wrote about jobs in 2021 and transportation last year. If you have deep thoughts about next year, we're all ears. So here I'm going to just walk you through 3 separate graphs about the housing market in the greater Capital Region. This is the Capital Region in dark purple relative to the US in light purple. So everything is relative to this first year in 2007. So you can see that during the Great Recession, the Capital Region fared a little bit better than the rest of the country if we measure in terms of new home mortgages. And this is the story of Washington, usually doing a little better during recessions and then a little bit worse as things recover. We don't do as bad when times are bad, and we do a little bit worse when times are good. That takes us up until the pandemic, when we see the Capital Region maybe catching up a little bit with the US, but not trending particularly differently. We're going to look and see, though, whether these patterns differ across different parts of the greater metro area. Oh, and I wanted to also say, my graph ends in 2001. That's because 2020, 2021?
2001 would be
Sorry, 2021. We don't even start in 2001. 2021, that's because, at least for mortgage data reporting nationally, it's as if the world has stopped and we're waiting for 2022 still, which is not to say that things are not quite different. So everything I'm going to show you is through 2021, but we all know that even after the end of these graphs, things have changed substantially. So we're going to look, however, at the region. We divide the region into urban, dark blue, suburban, light blue, and exurban in green here. And I'm going to show you a similar type of graph, so the number of new home mortgages initiated by year by urban, suburban, and exurban jurisdictions. And you can see that the exurban jurisdictions get hit the hardest in terms of mortgage numbers during the Great Recession. There's a sort of slow pickup in mortgage numbers throughout the region. And then you can get a hint of what you might have read about in the paper, this exurban flood during the pandemic. You can see that the mortgage numbers pick up in the exurban areas relative to the suburban areas, but you can also see that the urban mortgage numbers don't fall. So you might have read in the newspaper about the entire cities clearing out, and you don't see that here, and in fact, it was not the case. And it's interesting to compare those numbers with the mortgage values. So before I was showing you total mortgages issued in a given year, now I'm showing you the median value of mortgages. And you can see that, remember in the previous graph, we saw the number of mortgages falling in urban areas, but here you see the median value of those mortgages in urban areas increasing the most. Sort of flat in suburban areas after the Great Recession, a slight increase in exurban areas. Again, pretty flat up until the pandemic, maybe more of an increase in urban areas. And then we see an increase in median mortgage values everywhere. So it's not as if, while there may have been more mortgages being issued in exurban areas, values were increasing everywhere.
So these are big increases, right? This is 10, 20%, even though it doesn't look
Yes, those are big increases. That's an excellent point. But that gets us to today, when we know that this changing interest rate environment and other features have caused, I think, another large substantial change. And if I were going to make these graphs today, I would expect to see falling numbers of mortgages and at least flat, potentially falling median home mortgages. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Leah. And so these are sort of the big picture going through the pandemic up to 2021. And of course, after, sort of at the end of this period is when we start to see interest rates rising very quickly as the Federal Reserve tightens. And that, of course, has had its own effect on how housing markets have evolved and interacts with the sort of fallout from COVID, the changes in telework patterns that Brian talked about, in a way that really affects the entire market. But I think at least the perception is they, in particular, have affected sort of the urban core of different metro areas. And so our panel will be able to discuss all these various aspects. I'm going to first ask Katie to talk. Katie has some views on whether these developments have been as harmful for sort of downtown areas as the perception has sometimes been. And so, Katie, I'll let you talk. I believe you have a couple of slides as well.
We do.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation and following up on the research that you all have done. So I will tell you, as I read this report, which has been an excellent resource for me as a policymaker, one thing jumped out at me. As was true before the pandemic, neighborhoods with the very largest changes in recent homebuyer income were closest to the central business district. I am using the term downtown here because I think it's catchier than central business district. I will be clear, I don't just mean downtown DC. I mean Arlington's downtowns like Crystal City. I mean emerging downtowns like Tyson's in Virginia. These are places that are still desirable for homebuyers, they are still desirable for renters, and they still have an immense future before them. And so I think a lot of the conversation about, certainly during the pandemic, a generation leaving the cities in droves have been greatly exaggerated, and I think we are seeing those trends start to reverse themselves. What we are seeing, however, challenge our downtown areas is what has been talked about already to some extent, which is, in fact, the hollowing out of our office markets. We know that we are not going back to working the way we did before the pandemic, and that has been an enormous drag on the enormous increase on the vacancy rates of buildings throughout. So our most urban core areas are challenged now with higher demand for housing than ever and lower demand for office markets. So what do we do about it? So a couple of thoughts and priorities for urban jurisdictional governments like Arlington's, like the districts, like Alexandria's, and for its partners, which is broadly put, private sector, public partnerships. It takes a village here. So the first thing I would say is act like we're in a housing shortage, because we still are. Again, despite rumors about people leaving the area, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments estimated a few years ago that we would need 320,000 more units of housing to support the growing region by 2030. We are falling 8,000 to 10,000 homes short a year of producing those types of housing. We know that when there is not enough housing for jobs, the people who lose are those who can least afford housing. It absolutely perpetuates our homelessness problem. I really appreciated the connection that Brian made to that. And it creates workforce housing challenges too. So how do we deal with that? Well, in Arlington, we've taken on legalizing housing forms that increase ownership opportunity with the recent missing middle zoning reform, but that's going to look different in different jurisdictions. Our neighbors in Falls Church are creating transitional zones. Our neighbors in Alexandria are looking at coordinated development districts. And then the other piece I'd make a point about it with regard to the housing shortage, again, that housing shortage is manifesting by making it incredibly hard, as Stan and Brian were discussing, for lower income families or even moderate income families to find housing in our region. The COVID storm hit our economically vulnerable neighbors particularly hard. You talk about whiplash, right? These are folks who are greatly challenged by the end of eviction moratoria and the end of federal programs. The United Way just came out with some new data estimating that there are 500,000 households in the DMV who are working but asset limited and income constrained. And this is an equity issue. 1 in 4 people of color pay more than 50% of their income to rent each month. So we have huge inequities here. I look forward to discussing with Stan that sort of drive till you qualify model does not make sense for us as a region. And so we have to, I believe, keep our foot on the gas of these committed affordable development programs. And certainly the creation of the bricks and mortar programs, which we can maybe talk more about. I don't want to go on too long and keep from other colleagues, but I'll note a couple of other priorities, particularly as we look at that office vacancy rate. I think it's really important for us to invest in keeping our downtowns great. That can mean placemaking, the creation of amenities like parks. It can also mean programming and placemaking activities. Nobody talks about a transit thrive spiral. It's not a term, but I'm going to try to make it one because you have heard about the transit death spiral, where there is less investment in transit, service gets worse, ridership decreases, fare box recovery decreases, and it all goes downward. That works the reverse way too. If we invest in WMATA in particular, but also our regional bus systems, to expand more service and go more places, people will take transit. It supports our downtown, it makes them more livable, it makes the whole region more sustainable. And then I would note too, office residential we talk about a lot. It's a great tool. It's not a panacea for reasons that I think were well articulated. And so we need to think about other conversion opportunities. The last thing I'll say, since we're, is to be a little bit political about it, if we want to talk about this, one of the things we have seen very much in Arlington is the effects of the generational change in the ownership market. I would describe this as the unstoppable force of millennials buying their first homes. Millennials now represent a majority of buyers in our region, meets the immovable object of boomers who don't want to leave their homes. 66% told Freddie Mac in a survey just last month that they intend to age in their homes. The result of that, I can tell you because I've just lived through it and I'm a little bruised by it, is a massive political conflict. And I really think that part of the solution is for alternative forms. We need it all. We need transit-oriented condos that are attractive to seniors as well as mid-career folks. We need cottage housing, supportive housing for seniors. We need accessory dwellings. We need missing middle forms. We need all of it. That is the only way out of a scarcity mentality that I think is kind of creating this generational challenge in the ownership market. With that, I have exceeded my time. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Katie, thank you so much. Let me say a couple of things before we go to Nadia. I obviously, as an older millennial myself, I'm very sympathetic to one side of that conflict. But I wanted to say one way to think about a housing shortage, which maybe sounds like something that's difficult to measure, is to look at the difference between home prices and construction costs, right? And obviously those are so different in the DC region that we don't even really think to link them anymore almost. So I strongly agree with you that that's still a situation we're in. Anyway, with that, let me go to Nadia. You mentioned both sort of persistent inequalities in the housing market and ownership opportunities. So who better than someone from the National Association of Realtors to talk about ownership opportunities?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Stan. And Brian, Stan, thank you for talking about public housing and homelessness. So I think now it's a very good idea to talk a little bit about the challenges that people from different racial ethnic groups face in an effort to purchase a home. So in overall, what we see, and this is it's great to see, is that the American dream of homeownership has not been dampened by the pandemic. But Black homeownership rate has not kept pace with the increases in the other racial ethnic groups. So it's great to see that more Black Americans own their home now compared to 10 years ago. But the Black homeownership rate rose only by just 0.4 percentage points. However, the white homeownership rate rose by 3 percentage points, Hispanic homeownership rate by 4 percentage points, and Asian homeownership rate by 5 percentage points. So in the District of Columbia, what we see is that even though the gap between the white and the Black homeownership rate is a little bit smaller than the national level, the worrisome thing is that what we see is that significantly fewer Black Americans own their home in the District of Columbia. Black homeownership rate is 35%, so 1 in 3 Black Americans own their home, like in the District of Columbia. But the thing is that why is it difficult for these people more difficult for these people to purchase a home? So we need to know these reasons in order to be able to tackle this issue. What we see is that both Black homeowners and Black renters are more cost burdened than any other racial ethnic group. Like 30% of Black Americans spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. However, about 21% of the white Americans, homeowners, are cost burdened. In the District of Columbia, while we see that the gap between these two racial ethnic groups is even larger, we see about 31% of Black Americans in the District of Columbia spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and about 17% of white homeowners. Then when we take a look at the renters, what we see is that more than half of Black renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent. However, for white renters, we see about 45%. While in the District of Columbia, we see slightly fewer Black renters are cost burdened. it's very worrisome to see that only 3% of black renters here in the District of Columbia can afford to purchase currently the median price home in the area. So this can give us like some intuition of what to expect from the following years about the black homeownership rate, and how probably it's going to continue to lag well behind the national level and well behind the white homeownership rate. But beyond the affordability challenges, we also see that there are racial inequalities in the mortgage market. We see that denial rates vary by racial ethnic group, and black applicants experience the highest denial rates. So according to HMDA data, we see about 20% of black applicants were denied mortgages, compared to 11%, which is like for white applicants, and about 10% for Asian applicants. So these racial inequalities in the mortgage market can also explain why it's more difficult for these people to purchase a home, because as we know, purchasing a home is one of the largest financial transactions in a person's like lifetime, and about like 90% of home buyers finance their home purchase. So without like access to financing, this makes like even more difficult for them to purchase a home. But the question is, and every time they ask me, okay, we are talking about homeownership, but why homeownership like matters? Why it's so important for everybody to have the same opportunities to become a homeowner? And actually, we recently, I'm very happy for that. Recently, a report that we showed how homeownership can be catalyst to build wealth through homeownership. And the key takeaway was that everybody can build wealth through homeownership, even though the amount of wealth can vary among like income or racial ethnic groups. Again, everybody was able to accumulate a substantial amount of wealth in the last decade. Specifically, and also consider that home equity and retirement accounts represent about 60% of a person's net worth. So this is another reason that can show us that, yes, if you want to increase your net worth, that's one of the main ways to do it. Also, what we see is how we can do it. Like, we can build wealth through homeownership with two ways. First of all, a mortgage payment is also considered a forced savings account. Homeowners need to pay their mortgage every month in order to keep their property. And then the home of the value appreciates over time. So homeowners are able to accumulate wealth, to build wealth due to price appreciation. And actually, what we see in the last decade, the typical American was able to accumulate about $200,000 in the last decade, in the last 10 years. And when we go by income level, we see that low-income homeowners were able to accumulate almost like $100,000. And middle-income homeowners about more than $120,000. In the District of Columbia, in the Washington metro area, actually, what we see is that because home prices have increased like faster than nationwide, especially in the last couple of years, what we see is that the wealth gains are even larger. Like for low-income homeowners in the Washington, D.C. metro area, we see that they were able to build more than $125,000 in the last 10 years, and middle-income owners are more than $130,000. So, but even though when we take a look by racial ethnic group, even though black homeowners accumulate at the national level, experience the smallest wealth gains among any other racial ethnic group, again, they were able to build about more than $115,000 in the last decade. And in the DC metro area, we see that it's something like very opposite to the national trend. We see that homes owned by black Americans appreciate faster than any other racial ethnic group. So black Americans here in the District of Columbia, they were able to accumulate the largest wealth gains, and they were about like $180,000, almost like $200,000 in the last decade. So this is in a nutshell. I don't want to take more time.
Thank you, Nadia. No, it's good to hear. You know, one person's housing shortage is another person's opportunity for wealth accumulation, obviously. Anyway, with that, so that housing, of course, as Katie mentioned, the picture looks a little different, I think, for office space. And we have a panelist here who represents more office space than 99% of people in government or in the quasi-private sector. So, Jaren, why don't you tell us about downtown DC, what things are looking like, what priorities are for the business improvement district, and thank you for.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a pleasure. And thank you again, Stan. I'm just honored to be here. I feel smarter for being on this stage. You all are amazing. So I'm like, I hope I can follow this and give it some level of justice. But so excited to talk a little bit about downtown DC and just some of what we're seeing and what's happening now and where we see some potential opportunities. We represent the downtown DC bid geography is roughly 1 square mile, about 138 blocks total, roughly from North Capitol Street to 16th Street to the east-west. And we're just above the National Mall, so Constitution Avenue up to Massachusetts Avenue. And then we include the area around the Convention Center. So again, not a huge geographic area, but in terms of its economic impact, it's been quite significant for the city. Pre-pandemic, we had over $800 million in net fiscal impact per year because of so much tax revenue that's generated through the commercial property tax assessments as well as sales taxes generated just in that 1 square mile. When you look at our sort of neighboring business improvement district to the west, the Golden Triangle bid, which sort of extends from 16th Street up to about 23rd Street, we collectively make up the central business district. And in that space, of all the uses of buildings, in the downtown DC bid in particular, 78% of our buildings are dedicated to commercial office spaces. In the Golden Triangle bid, it's actually 97%. So very few other uses are truly in effect. We're probably on the better end of that spectrum in the downtown core because we have the Capital One Arena and the Convention Center and a number of museums and spaces that offer some cultural amenities. But one of the key things that's missing, and we look at our 98 million square feet of built space that we have, very little of that represents housing. We have in the downtown DC bid just over 10,000 residents and about 7,000 units. Altogether, mostly apartments, although we do have some condominium units as well at Gallery Place. And then actually the last significant residential development we had in downtown was the City Center project that's at 8th Street between 9th and 11th. There, I think we have 458 apartments and 131 condominium units. And actually, fun fact, I was noting sort of the change in value for homeowners in the urban core. The city center condos actually are the leader for the region in terms of resale. And so we saw the highest per square foot cost in its history since 2014 this past year in 2022. So very interesting just to see the resale value and what people sort of perceive to be high value.
Really in line with what Katie was saying too.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
The demand for housing in the urban core is still super strong, and it's office that's.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways, the story of the downtown DC core, here in the city, it's sort of unique. I mean, when you look at sort of just the span of development that's happened in this city, our bid was founded in 1997, and largely around the same time, there was a lot of newfound energy in revitalizing the Chinatown Gallery Place corridor, looking at bringing what was in the MCI Center to town, but sort of thinking about our downtown as a central entertainment and employment hub for the region. And I think even at that time, city leadership then had set out goals to build out an established residential. But what we saw is that it really didn't happen in the downtown core. It more so happened in what we consider like our downtown adjacent neighborhoods. So you saw really a surge in the Mount Vernon Triangle neighborhood, spaces like Shaw, communities like Shaw, Logan Circle, for which Brian is the ANC commissioner. So you can direct any inquiries for DC government right that way instead of this way. But no, we saw sort of the emergence of these other sort of residential cores, neighborhoods that when I was growing up didn't exist, Noma and some of these other spaces where you look at it and say, there's so many people here, but it's because there was sort of significant intentional investment in housing. What we're seeing now, as we're sort of dealing with the pandemic, and everyone knows the pandemic completely shifted the way people are interacting and working, what workday trends look like. We had an issue even before the pandemic with our commercial office vacancies. I think we were at just about 14% pre-pandemic, went up to about 16%. Most recently, we're looking at 19% vacancy overall. And moreover than that, our usage rates of offices are really pretty significantly down. we're still hovering at about 45 to 47% of where we were pre-pandemic. So that means less than half of the daytime foot traffic that you would normally see through your regional commuters, coming to downtown to clock in an office building are just not there. When you have half the people that were there before here now, you feel that. You feel that in the streets. You feel it as you walk around. It impacts your perception of are you safe. It has impacts for our transit system, whether or not people feel comfortable riding the train or feeling that the train service is as frequent as it should or could be. And it certainly impacts our businesses. We still have a number of restaurants that are concerned about the potential for lunch service, a number of sandwich shops and coffee shops that had to either significantly impact or adjust their hours or in some cases close down. But it had a real impact on the city. So how do you come out of all of that? What's the answer? What's the solution? We don't have the answer yet, right? And so I appreciate that this slide is still up here because I think certainly those first 2 bullet points are important. So one...
Only we can see it, to be clear.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that.
So don't reveal that we have this private information.
But so there's 2 lovely points here in front of me that I'll say again. One is to act like we're in a housing shortage because we still are. So I think one of the things that we're really looking at in terms of how to reimagine and establish our downtown, really at the behest of the mayor, who in her 5-year economic development plan sought out to say one big goal in this plan, and she's calling it the comeback plan. She wants to see 15,000 new residents in the downtown core by 2028. And whatever it takes to make that happen, she wants to see that because the additional infusion of residents will help add a vibrancy and vitality that then supports business and retail in a different way and helps to potentially save some of the revenues that would otherwise be lost by there being no use in downtown. And so that 15,000 resident goal is there. One of the things that we're working on in partnership with the mayor's office, myself at the Downtown DC bid, our friends at the Golden Triangle bid, as well as the Federal City Council, is starting what we're calling our Downtown Action Plan. We will be bringing in stakeholders from anyone who has a vested interest in downtown, whether you're in real estate or architecture or arts and culture, tourism, hotels, whatever it might be, and also just interested and curious residents and people in the region who want to see a downtown DC that thrives and belongs to them. We're bringing folks to the table to start outlining what some of the big, bold ideas are that'll help to push our downtown forward and to keep downtown great, right? So making sure that all of those great cultural amenities shine and continue to be of benefit, making sure that people feel safe and that we're being really intentional around issues around public safety, even addressing some of the challenges around homelessness. We operate the city's Downtown Day Services Center, which sees over 300 people per day who we're connecting to services to meet basic needs like showers and laundry, but also connecting people to housing counseling services and to other really important life services to help them along their path towards housing. But really being intentional around what are going to be the solutions that help to propel us forward. And I believe there's some hope in that residential conversion piece, but it's not the be-all end-all because we know that not every building is going to be suitable for it. And here in DC, we have a unique challenge given the height limits, where a lot of our buildings are wide but not tall. You don't have great footprints in some cases. Many of these mid-block buildings will be really hard to configure it in a way where you get enough light and air into the buildings. And so not every property is going to be a good candidate for a conversion. But I love the thinking around what else is possible with some of these buildings and some of these spaces. And so, we have talked about some of the shortages that we have with our city's convention network and system. So the convention center has been booming and doing business even better than they were pre-pandemic, but booked out for the next 3 to 4 years and often struggle to get some of the really bigger conferences in town because we just don't have enough meeting space. Well, hey, look, we have tons of building space that's not being used. Could that become an add to the convention center, right? We're looking at some of our university partners. We have Georgetown University expanding on the east end of downtown. Johns Hopkins purchased the old museum building and is looking to sort of consolidate some of their campus services for their professional studies there. And then we know that other colleges around the country like to be in DC or have a footprint here for their students to experience that. Well, why don't we double down on what that actually means and what that does and what that feels like for the students who are coming to DC and build intentional university nodes and campuses, right? And so all of these kinds of things are the things that we're going to net out in this Downtown Action Plan work and hopefully lift up some really great strategies that the city can point to. But I'm just excited because I think we are in a downturn and there's a lot of challenge here, but tons of opportunity to see a completely reimagined urban landscape here in the city.
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced actually, and you know, but in all seriousness, you can also tell a story about how, you know, with more telework and more flexible work arrangements, urban amenities become more valuable to residents, right? Because they now have a little more time to enjoy them. They don't have social interactions at work, and so may have more of a demand for social interactions outside the workplace. And you know, for that you need density, and so you can have that. I hadn't thought about the universities, but I've noticed there's a lot of universities that have a little campus here for I don't know, never clear to me how much of that is a boondoggle versus that. That's right. But anyway, that's outstanding. So I want to give everyone a chance to respond to what you've heard. Leah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm actually going to respond to all these thoughts with some thoughts from a paper that Stan and I wrote. Stan and I, and a third co-author, wrote a paper about the Washington, D.C. recovery or lack thereof from the 1968 civil disturbance. And I think that's a cautionary tale about how we would not like downtown Arlington, downtown Alexandria, downtown DC, all of these places to respond. Because what Stan and I found in that paper, and it's in a very different circumstance, I want to say, where buildings were entirely destroyed. But when we looked in neighborhoods and compared on the same block buildings that were destroyed in the civil disturbance to their neighbors on the same block, we found that it took them about 30 years to catch up in terms of having a structure. And in fact, the places that were destroyed have yet to catch up today in the average value of structure put in place. What makes me very nervous is a similar kind of bad lock-in with these like 1960s era buildings, which aren't good for residential, but they're not great for office either, right? So it's not as if you're taking the best of the office and it can stay office. You're taking the worst of the office. It can't stay office because nobody wants to rent it, but nobody wants it as residential either. I think this is like a fundamental problem. So I think that's problem number one.
Well, the optimistic view, right, as anyone who's ever presented at an academic conference, the less light and the uglier the room, the more suitable it is for, I don't know, the World Econometric Congress or whatever.
Which we should all go to, I guess, Stan. And then I think just one other point, which is looking forward, I think cities have both an opportunity and a challenge here, because once you take a building and you make it into housing, it is housing for generations. You don't get it back as office. Suppose in 10 years, cities realize, wait a minute, we rebalanced too far. You're done. Like you don't take the residential building and say, oh, condo people, sorry, we made a mistake. Like you're done. So I think it's a very delicate balancing act on the part of city planners and elected officials thinking about what the right mix is going forward.
And that's risky from a revenue perspective too, right? Just because taxation is much higher on commercial properties usually.
In DC.
Yeah.
In Virginia, they have to be equal.
I see. Do you want to add to what?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
I was just wrapped with that conversation about what some of those conversions are looking like in DC, and I really appreciate that insight. Leah, one of the things we have been thinking about a lot in a place with a very high office vacancy rate, Arlington is probably best known for being, in recent years, the winner of the HQ2 sweepstakes. And so we were really excited about the trajectory we're on. We've been working really hard to retain our offices, get down what had been a high vacancy rate after base realignment and closure. And we celebrated getting that rate down to, I think it was 16%, which is pretty close to the national average, in February 2020. So as you might imagine, it has been, we've been aghast at seeing how that's shot back up. And that's a long tail too, right? Because office leases tend to be 10 years or more. So we are expecting to really be hit with that over the coming years. So what about conversions? And Lee, I really love your point about the sort of suitability of that building. A couple of insights there. One is to just keep our eye on redevelopment. I think conversion feels so attractive to us because we like the idea of being thrifty and reusing those buildings. I think it's attractive to maybe nearby neighbors who are concerned about impacts on the neighborhood. But for all of the reasons you've heard about, it's not going to work everywhere. And I think we are now starting to see maybe some pressure on local governments and policymakers to make decisions that I'm not sure are the best ones. I think, not to call out DC. I just think this is evocative of kind of the risks, right? Like the office to residential conversion abatement program is by some measures a success. My understanding is that DC is now leading the country in the number of these. It is also estimated that about 4 years from now, that program is going to cost DC $7 million annually, increasing by 4% thereafter in lost tax revenue. And I worry a little bit about the idea of essentially, if the market isn't willing to fund these conversions, are we potentially socializing risk and privatizing reward, right? There are, for so many reasons that you put so well, reasons beyond just the tax base to try to bring residents back in, but those conversions are not without their cost. The only other thing I would say is there's also kind of a temporality here, and I was thinking about that, Lee, when you were talking about, well, whether 20 years from now, right, if things change. We've talked a lot about kind of interim uses, right? Before this building is ready to be redeveloped, property developers are, at the end of the day, a small C conservative bunch, right? The capital markets can be conservative. These projects are big, they're expensive. If there's some useful life to juice out of that building before a total redevelopment, what could that look like? Well, we found in Arlington, we have a 1930s era zoning ordinance that didn't conceive of higher education in a high rise or vertical urban farming or axe throwing as a socializing activity, right? And so none of these uses were conceived of or even allowed. So we've been doing a ton of work in Arlington, sort of under the headline of a commercial resiliency initiative, to just get more flexible about what can go here, so that you do, if you're not fully restoring the tax base that a fully occupied office building might bring, you are at least bringing some of that vitality back to our urban cores and not being the drag on the nearby businesses and the transit, et cetera.
Very good. Nadia, do you want to respond to?
I see the same trend that you mentioned a little bit about the universities, that there are like more universities like interested in leasing office spaces, and that's great to see, because if it's difficult, because we know the difficulty is like to convert it to residential for residential use, that's something else that we need to investigate, I think. And their main purpose to do that is because they want to bring like more students back to the classes, and the luxurious office buildings that can make them to come back. And I know some examples in Times Square as well, that they have interesting interest from a university, and I think this is very good to see that they're trying to find other ways how to utilize these empty office spaces. It's promising. Yeah.
No, I agree, and I think, I don't know, if you're a university in Ithaca, New York, you should just try to relocate as much of your activity as you can to. Anyway, and I think, but the Amazon Helix, I think that could be a cool apartment building. Okay, all right, so let's do some questions. I have a question here from someone on the internet, and then we're going to go to all the way in the back, and then we're going to take some more questions here. So first, question here, question for anyone, maybe Jaren is best. How will recent moves from big box stores like Walmart closing its 8th Street location and withdrawing its plans to open stores in Ward 7, how will they impact housing development in those neighborhoods? Not quite the downtown bid, but
so the Walmart closing in particular is just outside of our official boundary lines. But it's funny how many folks sort of asked us a similar question, like what will this mean, and will people not be as inclined to want to live there? And I'm going to totally butcher the statistic around this, but I know that proximity to groceries and a grocery store in particular is a big deciding factor for many people in terms of livability and where they want to be. And so that particular big box store had a significant grocery component. There's already been some significant interest from other potential grocer options who are interested in that space. And so there were some conversations at the recent ICSC conference in Vegas about some potential folks who might take that space as it is. And so not as big a concern there, I would say, but it is certainly a concern to think about what is the right mix of sort of the grocery and just other retail serving amenities that are needed. So as we're thinking about turning these neighborhoods that were not at all designed to accommodate communities and people living, what are some of those needs? That is central to the thinking and to the planning, for the future.
Very good. Let's go over there in the back.
Should I stand or sit?
Yes, please. And introduce yourself and then ask
Hi,
the question.
my name is Steve Luckett. I work and study here in the city. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the panelists. A question for you, young man or younger man, and our neighbor in the middle. First, could you address the vacancy rates downtown between, I guess, 14th Street toward the arena? I grew up in the Commonwealth in Northern Virginia. came to the city after undergrad, and now is an older, young father, live in Montgomery County. And when I do come into the city from time to time, I've seen some of the closed stores, which used to be pretty thriving. So I know the mayor is pretty much saying, you know, come back to DC, but I was told by some of the folk to mention a name, Marshalls, that the rents have just become sort of prohibitively high. So could you get to that end? And to the guest in the middle, you are awesome. Your slides are fantastic. You hit your marks like Tom Brady, minus the bad marriage and the crappy season. So again, I grew up in the Commonwealth. This is a very loaded question. Hopefully you can tackle it. What has Tyson's become? When I was a kid, it was like Woody's. You know, now they're apartment buildings and such. So, I mean, is it a juggernaut? Does it redefine cities or anything like that? So thank you all very much.
Man, such
Jerry,
good
you wanna go
questions.
first?
Should
Yeah,
I
you go
start?
first.
First of all, I will say I am technically a geriatric millennial as well, so I don't know, but I'll take the young man. I thank you, received. No, so the question, when we were talking about sort of vacancy before, I think I mentioned the 19%. I was really referring to our commercial office vacancy. Our retail vacancy rate, I think, is right now at like 22%, although I want to confirm that number, so please don't quote me on that. But what we really saw, you know, I mentioned sort of pandemic changing impacts, you know, that really low level of office sort of commuter utilization on a day-to-day has really impacted many of our otherwise retailers who were sort of reliant on that sort of consistent customer base. And so what's happened is a number of stores have closed their doors, right? And so we lost during the pandemic. So from March 2020 to present, we've had 30 different stores that have closed their doors in downtown. So it's a real and significant problem. But I will say too, it's also compounded on the reality that retail as a whole has been dealing with quite a few issues, just with the changes in shopping patterns nationally and more online versus brick and mortar retail. And so one of the things that we're thinking about and really exploring is really getting a sense of what is the right retail mix and retail strategy that appeals to the broadest base of customers, and sort of thinking about what are the right kinds of retail amenities that belong you know, in downtown, and how are we sort of thinking about patterns for those to exist. In some ways, we've been able to rest on the laurels of because we had so many office workers and a lot of commuters by day. That was sort of how we sort of allow the retail to play out however it will. I think what we're going to look at doing more intentionally for the future is really identifying nodes of centered activity. So where we have clusters of offices that are more that are busier and that have more people coming by day. And as we have proximity and vibrancy around some of our metro stops and stations, where we're looking at new residential development, being really intentional about the retail mix that is involved on the ground ground floor spaces of multiple buildings that could perhaps be in different ownership, but really bridging the gap to have those intentional conversations around what is our retail strategy. So it's not just one-off, this store happens to open on this block, this one happens to open there. Let's be really intentional about how we align that retail so that the experience for the person visiting from Virginia, the person who wants to come downtown to shop, it is consistent and it makes sense. So there's some work to do there. Also just want to flag City Center. I know I mentioned them in terms of the apartments and condominiums. That has become sort of the regional hub or one of the regional hubs for high-end luxury retail brands. And they have actually been performing considerably better than pre-pandemic levels. And so in a lot of ways, though you know they have some of the same challenges in terms of retail and shifts in patterns, that end of the market has been doing really well. And so I think that tells us something. I don't know exactly what it says, but there's some stories to learn and some trends for us to pay attention to in just terms of how people are shopping and what that experience feels like for folks. So.
And it reflects, and on some level, it reflects what you said, right? That people complaining that the rents are too high is in some sense a very good sign for the area. Let's go to the question over here.
Oh, and I totally took your time.
Sorry. After all the praise you got, I thought. Yeah. Tyson's. Sorry.
As Stan mentioned in introducing me back at the start of the program, I am leaving public service in Arlington after 8 years on the board there to go head up a new public-private partnership in Tyson's. So I'm very excited to talk about this. I really appreciate the question. Tyson's is such an interesting case as we talk about redevelopment, right? This is the country's 11th biggest employment center. It is known for Tyson's Corner Mall. Everyone you talk to in this region has a story about the Rainforest Cafe in the 1990s. And so what is so exciting about Tyson's is that the Fairfax County has a vision for it as a residential center as well, particularly with the arrival of new metro stations with the Silver Line extension. There is an opportunity to truly build sustainable transit-oriented development in an area that had been highway-oriented. So there is a lot of transformation to be done to make it the truly walkable, connected community it has the potential to be. And I think the creation of the Tyson's Community Alliance, which is the new organization, reflects a real understanding on the part of both the private sector and the public sector that neither can do it alone. The public sector is really the only entity that, working along with the state, can really engage in the type of transformative transportation projects that are necessary to bring some of those major throughways to grade and to really create walkability. But the private sector is the one that can move nimbly, that can support legacy retailers, that can create a greater sense of place and dynamism. So it really is exciting. I love that you asked that question, is what has Tyson's become? Because I am optimistic that in a couple years, we're going to be able to answer that confidently as America's next great downtown.
Boom. There you go. Okay. All right, let's go over here. Sorry. Please wait for the mic. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I live a couple miles from there. Carl Pulzer, I run a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity, and for 8 years, analyze inequality, advocate for the bottom 50%, because I didn't think many people were doing that in DC. And I have a sort of a request. This is a research place, and I would, you talked about equity and racial groups, but I think it would be more enlightening to go a little deeper. So compare different ethnic groups by their income. So I would like to see more research doing that. That would be more helpful to me, because you have all these people mixed in together and averages, and it just blends with a lot of rich people with a lot of poor whites. And I think what happens is we just have a catechism that we repeat over and over, but we don't really get down into the weeds where we need to really see the differences and the commonalities. People at the bottom have a lot in common. Poverty is not just, one ethnic group's monopoly. And also, to do a policy, you got to do it equitably across the country, and the ethnic groups that are poor vary. So can anybody tell me, like, for example, what the gap is in home ownership rate between the poorest people of different ethnic groups? Or how do I find that out? I'm sorry it took me so long to say that.
That's a great idea. We can do that. We haven't done it yet, but I think it's a good idea to drill down the data and go to that level as well. So
you have those nice credit score by loan value to income cells, right, in your data, so you can.
Yeah. So that can be done, but we haven't done it yet. We try not to give because we go to granular level as well, so we go at local level as well. So we haven't done this type of information. We haven't provided this data, not yet. But that's a very good idea. We have this report every year, so that's very good to hear the concerns from people.
And obviously, the income differences explain big chunks of the disparities and of denial rates. That's true for sure.
How much is income? How much is ethnic? Yeah. And then what do you do about it?
Yeah, no, for sure.
We have something that it's going to come out about how many home listings actually are missing by income group. So for people usually the mid income is about $75,000, and what we see in the United States, we have this information on local level as well. But I will give you an example. Or for Washington D.C. metro area, we also see that. Buyers earning less than $75,000, for example, they should afford to buy about 39%, almost 40% of the listings that homes available for sale, but what they can afford to buy is only 9%. So that way we're able to calculate what we should have from the point of listings. It's about 1,000 listings that we are missing. The price point up to $280,000. So yeah, we're trying to put something more than raising the issue of affordability, and this will come soon out.
Thank you. Let's do these two final questions. Let's take them together and then answer them together. We're running out of time.
I'll try to give you an easy question. Hi, Ryan McLaughlin. I'm with the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. We represent about 14,000 realtors in the greater Northern Virginia region. My question is about going back to supply. Two of the issues that are affecting supply are interest rates And another potential one are the impact of the capital gains tax limits. And maybe this is for you, Nadia, but how much of an effect are you seeing on interest rates on homeowners wanting to put their home for sale and rather than just sitting on it? And the same with the capital gains exclusion. If because the limit has not been increased in however many decades it is, do you see that as affecting homeowners' decisions to actually put their homes on the market to take a piece of that equity that they've earned over the last so many years?
And some people may want to reduce the exclusion. Let's take the other question. Sorry, right here. Please wait for the mic. Sorry. So the people out there on the internet can hear you. Please don't tackle B. Yeah.
A question and a comment, but I'll start with the question just in a personal.
Let's do only the question.
Pardon me?
Let's do only the question, if you don't mind.
All right.
We're running out of time.
No worries.
Okay.
As an Arlington resident, I'm curious, but also for the larger region, what is the thought about what Amazon's going to do with HQ2 and the Helix? Do we have any kind of sense?
Do you want to start with Ryan's question?
Yes, let's start with the second question, and then we'll go to Nadia.
Start with the second question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and nice to meet you as one of my bosses. So we followed this closely. I think one of the things we talked about a lot when Amazon made the decision to locate was that if you looked at the number of employees Amazon planned to hire in the region, it represented about 5% of the annual growth in jobs that was already happening in the region. We also knew that Amazon had chosen Arlington, certainly not because it was cheap, but because of the talent that was already here in the region. And so that has really been borne out when you look at whom they have hired. They tend to be people who were already here. And even if they were to have hired all of those people from Des Moines and they moved to Arlington, 5% of the growth in the market is probably not going to have dramatic changes on our housing prices. And one of the ways we've talked about that in Arlington was, again, at the time Amazon made its announcement, we had a 20% office vacancy rate. If the presence of jobs was what drove in Arlington alone, was what drove the housing market, we would have seen housing prices not increase by 25% over 3 years. So I think there is a little bit of a disconnection between those two things. I do think there were probably some hyper-local effects after Amazon's location decisions. I bet Ryan actually and some of his colleagues in the Northern Virginia retailers could talk about that, but I think you too, I think there were maybe a lot of homeowners who did what we saw all homeowners do, which was take their homes off the market because they thought that they might be sitting on a bigger asset a few years from there. And then I think I'm sure that was simply just a selling point. So I wouldn't be surprised, if our neighborhoods like Aurora Highlands or high-end condos in Crystal City maybe saw a bump in that submarket. But I don't see Amazon as a driver of the housing market. Overall, again, because of its relatively small influence, jobs in terms of the job growth for the region overall.
Thank you. And then Nadia, you want to close this out? Why are there so few houses on the market?
Sure. So yeah, we definitely see the lock-in effect, like for so many homeowners. They don't want to give up the great rates that they have, that they were able to secure, like in 2021. And we also see that a drop like in mortgage applications as well, like and originations like in 2022. So we also see that's the reason that we have low supply. Like we compared to a year ago, housing supply has increased about like 7% according to our latest data. But again, we're still like missing about like 1 million homes in order to be in a more balanced market, to have about 6 months supply and to secure that, yeah, we are somewhere close to balance. So yeah, the fact with the interest rates and mortgage rates is going to affect the housing market, and that's the reason we expect price gains to rebound soon. We have some price declines at the national level as well, but I think due to low inventory that will continue to remain tight, this will bring, like, I think after the summer months, will bring like a price appreciation, like a back in the housing market. So I think that was the question, right?
Yeah.
There was another
Exclusion, but that I think we'll leave that for another day. Thank you so much. With that, thanks to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for your questions. Have a good day. Awesome. Fantastic.